They tried to tell me I had to sell my family's ranch. Not ask, mind you, but tell me. Their offers weren't just low, they were insulting. A blatant attempt to strong-arm me off land that had been in my bloodline for over a century. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom in their little world of matching mailboxes and obsessively manicured lawns, was that their entire pristine, entitled neighborhood was, in a very real sense, already mine. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, folks, because you are not going to believe the sheer audacity, the intricate web of forgotten history, and the sweet, sweet taste of karmic justice that unfolded. This story is proof that sometimes the biggest bullies are standing on ground a lot shakier than they think. I'm still kind of amazed I pulled this off, going from nearly being forced out to essentially owning the HOA that tried to destroy me. It all started, as these things often do, with a polite little letter. Or rather, a letter that draped itself in the veneer of politeness, the kind that uses pleasantries as a flimsy cover for an iron fist. I'd lived on the Oakhaven Ranch my entire life, save for college and a few years working in the city as a forensic accountant, a skill set that, unbeknownst to them, would become their undoing. The ranch wasn't just property, it was a sprawling tapestry of memories, of my grandfather teaching me to ride, of summer nights listening to crickets under a blanket of stars so thick you felt you could reach out and touch them. It was 300 acres of rolling hills, ancient oaks, and a creek that whispered secrets as it meandered towards the river. To the west, hugging my property line like a nervous barnacle, was the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, a relatively new development, maybe 20 years old, carved out of what used to be Old Man Hemlock's less productive pasture land. I'd always kept to myself, maintained my fences, and generally been what I considered a good neighbor, even if their definition of neighborly seemed to involve a lot more beige paint and a lot less actual interaction. The letter, on impressively thick cardstock, embossed with the Whispering Pines HOA logo, two anemic-looking pine trees, whispering sweet nothings to each other apparently, was from their president, a Ms. Karen. Wait, no, it was Brenda Milligan, though to be fair, the energy was distinctly Karen-esque. It spoke of community harmony and aesthetic cohesion, phrases that always make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It then gently suggested that a working ranch, with its, and here I quote, rustic charm and associated agricultural activities, was perhaps no longer synergistic with the evolving upscale residential character of the area. It concluded with an offer to discuss the HOA acquiring my property for a fair market value, which they would determine, of course. There was no figure mentioned, just the implication that they were doing me a favor. I chuckled, filed it under circular, and went about my day. My version of rustic charm involved actual livestock and the scent of honest work, not faux distressed patio furniture. Their version of upscale seemed to involve a lot of passive aggression and an almost pathological fear of anything that wasn't a shade of gray. A week later, Miss Brenda Milligan herself appeared at my gate. She drove a pristine, almost blindingly white Escalade that looked like it had never seen a gravel road, let alone a speck of mud. It was the kind of vehicle that screamed, "I demand to speak to the manager of the entire county." Brenda herself was a woman of about 50, impeccably dressed in expensive athleisure wear that suggested she spent more time selecting the outfit than actually engaging in athletics. Her hair was a helmet of blonde ambition, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which scanned my comfortable, slightly rambling ranch house with an expression one might reserve for discovering a particularly resilient strain of mildew. "Mr. Caldwell?" she chirped, her voice a little too bright, a little too forceful. "Brenda Milligan, HOA president. We sent you a letter?" I confirmed I'd received it, my tone carefully neutral. I'm a patient man, but I have a low tolerance for condescension wrapped in a designer tracksuit. "Wonderful," she trilled. "So, we were hoping to discuss our very generous proposal. You see, the community feels, well, that your property, while undoubtedly holding sentimental value for you, is somewhat anachronistic." We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for the entire parcel, for a quick, clean sale. I almost choked on my own spit. 200,000? For 300 acres of prime land? A historic ranch house? Barns? Outbuildings? Water rights? The land alone was worth 10 times that, probably more given its proximity to their upscale residential enclave. My grandfather, a man who could smell a bad deal from a county away, would have spun in his grave. "Miss Milligan," I said, keeping my voice level despite the insult boiling in my gut. "Respectfully, that offer is not just low, it's imaginative. The ranch is not for sale, and certainly not at that price." Her smile faltered, replaced by a moue of displeasure. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps you don't understand. The character of Whispering Pines is very important to our residents. Your operations are increasingly becoming a point of contention. The smells, the noise from your animals, the general untidiness along the fence line facing our community." Untidiness? I mended that fence myself last spring. It was sturdy, functional, and definitely not leaning or broken. The smells were of hay and honest manure, part of any working ranch. The noise was the occasional moo or whinny. "We believe this offer is more than fair considering the circumstances." The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and cloying as cheap perfume. "Circumstances?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "Like the circumstance of you wanting my land for a pittance?" She huffed, her carefully constructed composure starting to crack. "We are trying to be reasonable, Mr. Caldwell, but the HOA has a mandate to protect property values. And a farm? Right next door isn't conducive to that. We have bylaws, you know, standards." I knew all about their bylaws. My friend Sarah, who'd made the mistake of buying a house in Whispering Pines before realizing Brenda was her self-appointed overlord, had given me an earful. Bylaws that dictated the precise shade of beige for your window trim, the maximum height of your petunias, and, apparently, the acceptable proximity of historical agricultural enterprises. Your bylaws, Miss Milligan, apply to properties within Whispering Pines. My ranch, as you are well aware, is not, and it will remain so. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." I gave her my most polite, dismissive nod and turned back towards my house. Her Escalade peeled out with a distinct lack of rustic charm, spraying a little gravel. This, I sensed, was only the beginning. And that's when I started to pull out my old family records, just to refresh my memory on a few things my grandfather had always been so meticulous about. He always said, "Know your land, son. Know its history, know its boundaries, and know every single piece of paper ever signed concerning it. Because one day, that knowledge will be worth more than all the gold in California." He wasn't wrong. I had a feeling Brenda Milligan was about to get a very expensive education in Oakhaven Ranch history. The harassment started subtly, then escalated with the clumsy predictability of a B-movie villain. First, it was anonymous complaints to the county about animal waste runoff. Despite my diligent adherence to all environmental regulations and the fact my creek flowed away from Whispering Pines, the county inspector, a grizzled fellow named Dale who'd known my family for generations, came out, took one look around, sighed, and said, "Another one from your fan club, huh? Everything's fine here, just like last time." Then came the letters from the HOA, citing me for visual blight because a patch of wildflowers, native mind you, and beautiful, had dared to bloom along the shared fence line. Apparently, my Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susans were offensive to their cultivated sensibilities, which seemed to favor sterile green lawns that looked like they'd been painted on. Each letter was on that same thick cardstock, each signed with Brenda Milligan's imperious flourish. I started a new file, labeled HOA Shenanigans, and meticulously documented everything: dates, times, photographs, copies of correspondence. My forensic accounting instincts were kicking in. Always follow the paper trail, always document the inconsistencies. Brenda, it turned out, wasn't content with just paper warfare. One afternoon, I found a surveyor on my property, well inside my fence line, near the old oak where my grandfather used to tell stories. He looked flustered when I approached him. "Ma'am, Mr. Caldwell, right?" Brenda Milligan hired me to survey the boundary. She said there was a dispute. "There's no dispute," I said calmly, though my blood pressure was rising. "This is my land and you're trespassing. The boundary is clearly marked by that fence, which has been there for 60 years. The surveyor, a young guy probably just trying to make a living, stammered an apology and packed up his equipment, but not before I got his card and made a note of the company he worked for." Brenda was clearly trying to manufacture a boundary dispute, perhaps hoping to chip away at my acreage bit by bit. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to gaslight me about my own property lines. The offers kept coming, too, each one incrementally higher than the last, but still laughably inadequate. 250,000. Then, with a dramatic sigh as if she were personally funding it, 300,000. "This is our final offer, Mr. Caldwell," she'd said during another unwelcome visit, her Escalade idling impatiently at my gate like a getaway car. "Take it, or we'll have to explore other avenues to protect our community's interests." "Other avenues?" I asked, leaning against the gatepost, arms crossed. "Like what, Ms. Milligan? Are you planning on annexing my land via a hostile takeover of Petunia regulations?" Her face tightened. She did not appreciate sarcasm, especially when it highlighted the absurdity of her position. "There are ways," she said vaguely, ominously. "Legal ways. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions." I knew she was bluffing about any legitimate legal ways to force a sale, but the constant pressure was designed to wear me down. She underestimated my connection to this land, and more importantly, she underestimated my patience and my capacity for meticulous research. Every evening, after the ranch chores were done, I'd spread out the old maps, deeds, and ledgers on my grandfather's massive oak desk. He'd kept everything, and I mean everything. Promissory notes from the 1920s, water rights agreements from the 1940s, and, most intriguingly, a thick, leather-bound volume simply labeled Land Leases Agreements. Most of it was mundane: grazing leases for neighboring ranchers from decades past, right-of-way permissions for the county power lines. But one entry, dated almost exactly 25 years ago, caught my eye. It was a long-term ground lease, a 99-year agreement, for a substantial parcel of land adjacent to Oakhaven. The lessee was a development corporation I'd never heard of, Pioneer Valley Homes, Inc. The description of the leased land, however, set my pulse racing. It matched almost perfectly the footprint of Whispering Pines Estates. I cross-referenced the parcel numbers, the meets and bounds descriptions. My heart hammered against my ribs. It couldn't be. Could it? My grandfather had been a shrewd man, a visionary in his own quiet way. He'd always talked about land being the only thing they weren't making more of. But leasing out that much prime acreage for a residential development? It seemed out of character, unless the terms were exceptionally favorable to him and, by extension, to his heirs. The lease document itself was a masterpiece of archaic legal language, dense and convoluted. But as I painstakingly deciphered it, a slow smile spread across my face. Pioneer Valley Homes, Inc. had developed Whispering Pines, and then, as often happens, had likely sold off the individual lots to homeowners, with the HOA eventually taking over common areas and responsibilities. But the underlying ground lease, the master agreement that governed the very land their houses sat upon, was with my family. And the HOA, in their blissful ignorance and towering arrogance, seemed to have no idea. Or if they did, Brenda Milligan certainly wasn't acting like it. The lease also contained some fascinating clauses regarding nuisance and interference with the lessor's retained property, namely Oakhaven Ranch. It stipulated that the lessee, and by extension their successors and assigns, which would include the HOA and its residents, must not engage in activities that unreasonably disturbed the quiet enjoyment of Oakhaven. Brenda Milligan, with her harassment campaign and her lowball offers, wasn't just being a bad neighbor. she was potentially violating the very terms of the agreement that allowed Whispering Pines to exist. This was no longer just about defending my ranch. This was about reminding a very arrogant HOA who truly held the high ground. My grandfather hadn't just left me land, he'd left me a hidden arsenal. And Brenda Milligan was about to march her Escalade straight into the kill zone. The next few weeks were a masterclass in controlled patience on my part, and escalating buffoonery on Brenda's. Armed with the knowledge of the ground lease, my perspective shifted. Her increasingly desperate attempts to oust me were no longer just irritating, they were darkly comedic. It was like watching a fly buzz angrily around a spider web, completely unaware of the intricate trap it was already caught in. I decided to consult with legal counsel, not because I doubted my findings, but because I wanted to ensure every step I took was strategically sound and legally airtight. I found an attorney named Arthur Jenkins, a semi-retired property law specialist with a reputation for being as sharp as a tack and possessing a deliciously dry wit. His office was a delightful throwback, filled with leather-bound books and the faint, pleasant scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, though he himself didn't smoke. He listened intently as I laid out the history, Brenda's campaign of harassment, and finally, the details of the ground lease my grandfather had so cannily negotiated. Arthur's bushy eyebrows climbed steadily higher as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaky leather chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his eyes twinkling, "your grandfather was either a seer or the luckiest man in 3 counties. This is beautiful." He reviewed the lease document with a barrister's precision, occasionally chuckling to himself. "Oh, she's really stepped in it, hasn't she? Nuisance and interference affecting the lessor's retained dominant estate. It's right here, clear as day. And this clause about conduct unbecoming of a good tenant. Magnificent. Your grandfather had a poet's soul for contractual obligations." Arthur advised a strategy of calculated silence regarding the lease for the time being. "Let her continue to incriminate herself, Mr. Caldwell. Let her escalate. The more unreasonable her actions, the stronger our position when we finally choose to enlighten her." So, I continued to meticulously document every new transgression. There was the incident where the HOA's preferred landscaping company accidentally sprayed herbicide along a 10-foot stretch of my fence line, killing a beautiful stand of heirloom roses my grandmother had planted. The landscapers, when I confronted them, nervously admitted Ms. Milligan had indicated that area needed to be cleared for better visibility. Better visibility of what? My compost heap? Then there were the anonymous calls to animal control, claiming my cattle were malnourished. Bessie, my prize-winning Hereford, who was so spoiled she probably expected daily spa treatments, would have been deeply offended. Animal control, of course, found nothing amiss, just more wasted county resources thanks to Brenda's vendetta. Each new outrage was another nail in her coffin, another piece of evidence for Arthur's growing file. Meanwhile, Brenda, emboldened by my lack of aggressive pushback, which she clearly mistook for weakness, cranked up the pressure. The HOA sent a new offer, this time for $350,000, delivered by certified mail and accompanied by a letter dripping with condescension. It stated this was their final, irrevocable offer, and that if it was not accepted within 30 days, they would be forced to pursue all available legal remedies to resolve this untenable situation for the betterment of the Whispering Pines community. The sheer gall was almost admirable, in a perverse way. They were threatening legal action against me for existing on my own land, while simultaneously being in probable breach of the very agreement that allowed their houses to stand. Arthur and I had a good laugh over that one. All available legal remedies? Arthur mused. I wonder if that includes discovering they're effectively tenants on your land and have been behaving like a pack of entitled delinquents. I also started discreetly talking to some of the Whispering Pines residents I knew to be more reasonable, like my friend Sarah. I didn't reveal the full extent of my leverage yet, but I shared my frustrations about Brenda's tactics. Sarah was aghast. She told us at the last HOA meeting that you were being stubborn and uncooperative about a generous offer to beautify the community entrance, she exclaimed. She made it sound like you were practically running a junkyard over there. Most people just believe what she says. She's very forceful. It turned out Brenda had been spinning quite the tale, painting me as the villainous recluse standing in the way of progress and higher property values. Some residents, particularly those in her inner circle, a clique of equally self-important individuals I mentally dubbed the Beige Brigade, were fully on board with her campaign. They'd bought into the narrative that my ranch was an eyesore dragging down their precious equity. Others, however, were starting to have doubts. Whispers of Brenda's overreach were beginning to circulate. A few even anonymously slipped notes into my mailbox expressing support or apologizing for the HOA's actions. These small acts of quiet rebellion were heartening. They confirmed that not everyone in Whispering Pines was a Brenda clone. These were the enablers by silence, perhaps, but some were clearly uncomfortable. Brenda, however, remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on her manicured horizon. She saw my quiet documentation and polite but firm refusals as signs that I was faltering, that I was an isolated old rancher who would eventually cave. She had no idea that my forensic accounting background had trained me to find the patterns in the noise, to uncover the truth buried under layers of obfuscation. And she certainly had no idea that my grandfather's foresight had laid a decades-old trap, baited with prime real estate and triggered by arrogance. The 30-day deadline on their final offer was approaching. Arthur and I decided it was time to prepare our response. It wouldn't be an acceptance, nor a simple rejection. It would be an education, a very, very expensive education for Ms. Brenda Milligan and the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. The delicious irony was that her own aggressive tactics, her relentless pursuit of my land, were about to hand me the keys to her kingdom, or, more accurately, remind her that I'd owned them all along. The stage was being set for a reveal that would, I hoped, cause the meticulously applied foundation on Brenda's face to crack wide open. The 30-day deadline passed, with no word from me regarding their final, irrevocable offer. I could almost feel Brenda Milligan's impatience radiating across the fence line. Sarah confirmed that Brenda had been crowing at informal neighborhood get-togethers about how she had the old rancher on the ropes and expected a signed sales agreement any day. The Beige Brigade was apparently already discussing plans for the Oak Haven Annex, envisioning a new community pool, maybe some pickleball courts, all on my land. Their hubris was a thing of terrifying beauty. Arthur Jenkins and I, meanwhile, were meticulously preparing our own package. It wasn't an offer, it was a notification. A very polite, very legally sound notification that Whispering Pines Estates was, in fact, situated entirely on land leased from the Caldwell Family Trust, and that their recent actions constituted multiple breaches of said lease. We included a certified copy of the original ground lease, highlighted relevant clauses pertaining to nuisance, interference, and the obligations of the lessee, and a detailed log of every instance of harassment, complete with dates, photographic evidence where applicable, and copies of their own increasingly threatening correspondence. The coup de grace was a gentle reminder of the lease's impending review period in just under 2 years, and the lessor's rights concerning renewal or termination based on adherence to the lease terms. We decided against simply mailing it. This was news that deserved a more personal delivery. Brenda, however, saved us the trouble of orchestrating a confrontation. 2 days after the deadline expired, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Sarah tipped me off. "She's furious you didn't respond," Sarah whispered over the phone. "She's telling everyone you're playing games and that the HOA needs to authorize legal action to compel the sale through appropriate channels. She's even got some shyster lawyer she knows on standby. You should hear her. She's practically foaming at the mouth." "Compel the sale?" I chuckled. "What channels would those be, I wonder? The imaginary ones?" "She's convinced there's a way," Sarah said. "Something about blighted property acquisition for community improvement. It sounds completely bogus, but she's very convincing when she's on a rampage." This was perfect. Brenda was about to publicly impale herself on her own sword of arrogance. Arthur, when I informed him, rubbed his hands together with unconcealed glee. "Oh, this is richer than I dared hope, Mr. Caldwell. A public forum? Her own chosen stage for her downfall? Magnificent." The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse, a building that, like everything else in the development, was aggressively beige. Arthur and I decided to make an entrance. We arrived about 10 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin, allowing Brenda ample time to whip her audience into a frenzy of righteous indignation. As we walked in, Brenda was mid-tirade, her voice sharp and brittle. She stood at a lectern, a vision in a power-red pantsuit, gesturing emphatically. And this stubborn refusal to even acknowledge our generous offer, an offer significantly above what that dilapidated property is truly worth, is an insult to every single homeowner in Whispering Pines. It demonstrates a clear disregard for our community, our values, and our collective investment. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled crowd of about 50 residents. Some looked angry, others self-righteous. A few, like Sarah, who gave me a subtle nod, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Brenda paused for dramatic effect, then spotted us standing at the back of the room. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face. "Ah, Mr. Caldwell, finally decided to join us? Perhaps you're here to tender your acceptance of our offer? Or did you just come to witness this community unanimously vote to pursue legal action against your nuisance property?" "Actually, Ms. Milligan," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily in the suddenly silent room, "we're here to discuss a rather critical oversight in your assessment of the situation, and to provide some much-needed clarification on property rights and contractual obligations." Arthur Jenkins, looking every bit the distinguished legal scholar, stepped forward beside me, carrying a handsome leather briefcase. Brenda's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Oversight? Mr. Caldwell, the only oversight here is your failure to comprehend the inevitable. Whispering Pines will not be held hostage by your pastoral fantasy." "My pastoral fantasy, as you call it, Ms. Milligan," I replied, allowing a hint of steel into my voice, "is built on land I own outright. Your Whispering Pines estates, however." I paused, letting the anticipation build. "Well, that's a slightly more complicated matter." Arthur chose that moment to step forward. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arthur Jenkins, and I am legal counsel for Mr. Caldwell and the Caldwell Family Trust. We have some information that we believe is of vital importance to every homeowner in this association." He opened his briefcase and began distributing copies of a neatly bound document to the front rows, asking them to pass them back. Brenda watched, her expression shifting from arrogance to confusion, then to a dawning, horrified realization as she caught sight of the cover page of the document now making its way towards her. Notification of lease terms and potential breaches. Ground lease agreement, dated June 14th, 1978, between Caldwell Agricultural Holdings and Pioneer Valley Homes, Inc. Brenda's face went white, a stark contrast to her power-red pantsuit. She snatched a copy from a bewildered-looking member of the Beige Brigade, her eyes darting frantically across the first page. The room was utterly silent now, save for the rustle of paper as residents began to read. This is preposterous," Brenda finally sputtered, her voice losing its commanding tone, cracking slightly. "What is this nonsense?" "It's not nonsense, Ms. Milligan," Arthur said gently, though his eyes held no sympathy. "It is a legally binding 99-year ground lease, executed by Mr. Caldwell's grandfather and the original developers of Whispering Pines. It clearly stipulates that the land upon which your homes are built, the common areas, this very clubhouse, is owned by the Caldwell Family Trust. You, the homeowners of Whispering Pines, are, in effect, sublessees or beneficiaries under that master lease." A collective gasp went through the room. People were looking at each other, then at Brenda, then at the documents in their hands, expressions of shock and disbelief spreading like wildfire. "But we own our homes," one man exclaimed from the crowd. You own the building, sir? Arthur clarified. The structures, but the land itself is leased. A rather common arrangement in certain types of developments, though often forgotten over time by subsequent homeowners if not properly disclosed at every sale. And that lease, I interjected, stepping forward, contains some very specific clauses. Clauses about not causing nuisance or interference to the lessor, that's me, or my retained property, Oak Haven Ranch. Clauses about maintaining a good faith relationship. For the past several months, Ms. Milligan, acting as president of this HOA, has engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment, frivolous complaints, attempted trespass, and bad faith negotiations, all designed to pressure me into selling my ancestral home to you for a fraction of its worth. I gestured to the latter half of the document bundle. You'll find a detailed log of these activities appended, including copies of your own letters and a record of the insultingly low offers made. These actions, Ms. Milligan, constitute significant breaches of the ground lease. Brenda was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The red of her pantsuit seemed to mock her ashen complexion. The shyster lawyer she'd supposedly had on standby was conspicuously absent, or perhaps had wisely chosen this moment to develop a sudden, urgent appointment elsewhere. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely, so irrevocably, it was almost palpable. The Beige Brigade looked stunned, their smug expressions replaced with ones of dawning horror as they realized their fearless leader had led them not to a glorious land acquisition, but to the brink of a legal abyss that threatened the very foundation of their homes. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Arthur Jenkins cleared his throat. Given these breaches, he announced, his voice resonating with quiet authority, the Caldwell Family Trust is now reviewing all its options under the terms of the lease. These options, as outlined within the agreement, could include seeking significant financial damages for said breaches, demanding immediate cessation of all interfering activities along with substantial penalties, or, in the most extreme interpretation, of repeated and willful violation, exploring the avenues for early termination of the master lease agreement. The last phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. Termination. The implication was clear. If the lease was terminated, the land and everything on it could potentially revert to the Caldwell Trust. The manicured lawns, the beige houses, the pickleball court dreams, all of it could vanish. Brenda Milligan finally found her voice, a choked, strangled whisper. You can't. Oh, I assure you, Miss Milligan, Arthur said, his tone still mild but with an underlying firmness that was unmistakable. The terms are quite explicit. Your grandfather, Mr. Caldwell, was a remarkably thorough man. The Queen had been checkmated, on her own board, using rules she never even knew existed. The aftermath in the Whispering Pines clubhouse was a scene of controlled chaos and dawning panic. Brenda Milligan looked like she'd seen a ghost, or perhaps her entire meticulously curated life flashing before her eyes. Her usual air of imperious command had utterly deflated, leaving behind a bewildered, almost pathetic figure. The members of her Beige Brigade, who moments before had been baying for my metaphorical blood, were now staring at their documents with expressions of pure, unadulterated horror. Questions erupted from the crowd, no longer directed at me with hostility, but with a desperate, pleading edge. What does this mean for our homes? Are you going to kick us out? How could we not know about this? Arthur Jenkins, ever the consummate professional, calmly addressed their concerns. Ladies and gentlemen, please, he said, raising his hands for quiet. Mr. Caldwell has no immediate desire to displace anyone. His primary objective has always been to live peacefully on his ranch without harassment. However, the actions of your HOA president have created a serious legal situation that must be addressed. He then methodically walked them through the key implications. The land was leased. The lease had terms. Those terms had, according to our evidence, been repeatedly breached by the HOA under Miss Milligan's leadership. The focus in the room shifted palpably towards Brenda. Angry murmurs started to ripple through the crowd, no longer supportive but accusatory. "You knew about this, Brenda," someone shouted. "Did you know and not tell us you were jeopardizing our homes?" Brenda, still ashen, stammered, I I may have seen some old paperwork, but I thought it was irrelevant. A historical footnote. This is a modern development." "A modern development built on a very old and very binding agreement, Miss Milligan," Arthur corrected smoothly. "Ignorance of the lease, or a willful disregard for its terms, does not negate its validity." That night, the HOA meeting disintegrated. Brenda Milligan's reign of terror ended not with a bang, but with the rustle of damning legal documents and the horrified whispers of betrayed homeowners. Within a week, she had resigned as HOA president. The white Escalade, once a symbol of her suburban dominance, was seen parked forlornly in her driveway, eventually sporting a "for sale" sign in its window. Word got around that she and her husband were selling their house, presumably before the full financial implications of her disastrous leadership became apparent to the other residents who might seek personal recourse against her for diminishing their property values or exposing them to legal risks. It was a quiet, ignominious retreat. The new HOA board, hastily assembled and thoroughly chastened, approached Arthur and me with an entirely different demeanor. Gone was the arrogance and entitlement. In its place was a palpable sense of humility and a desperate desire to make amends. Their legal counsel, a sensible woman named Miss Albright, who seemed mortified by her predecessors, Brenda's shyster friend, apparent incompetence, or Brenda's complete misrepresentation of the facts to him, conceded almost every point. Negotiations began, not about the sale of my ranch, but about the future of Whispering Pines. We didn't demand termination of the lease. That had always been the nuclear option, a terrifying leverage point rather than a desired outcome. My family weren't developers. We were ranchers. We wanted peace, not a subdivision. However, the terms of their continued existence on Caldwell land were about to change significantly. Firstly, a formal public apology was issued by the HOA to me, published in the community newsletter, and read aloud at a special meeting. Secondly, a substantial annual ground rent, far more reflective of the land's current value, was established. This rent, payable to the Caldwell Family Trust, would be a permanent feature of their budget, a yearly reminder of their obligations and the true ownership of the land beneath their feet. The funds, I decided, would go towards significant upgrades for Oakhaven Ranch, preserving its legacy for generations to come, and a portion would establish a local agricultural scholarship. Thirdly, new covenants were added to the master lease agreement, specifically forbidding any HOA actions, rules, or resident behaviors that could be construed as harassment or interference with the operations or quiet enjoyment of Oakhaven Ranch. I was also granted a permanent, non-voting advisory seat on the HOA board, ensuring that the landowner's perspective would always be considered in their future decisions. My rustic charm, it seemed, was now a protected feature. The fence line between Oakhaven and Whispering Pines became a symbol of this new understanding. The herbicide-damaged roses were replaced, at HOA expense, with an even more beautiful display. The wildflowers were allowed to bloom freely. The sounds and smells of a working ranch were no longer grounds for complaint, but accepted as part of the local character, a character they now paid handsomely to be adjacent to. My friend Sarah was elected to the new HOA board, and she reported that the entire atmosphere in Whispering Pines had changed. With Brenda's oppressive influence gone, a more genuinely neighborly spirit began to emerge. People were friendlier, less obsessed with superficial conformity. It turned out, stripping away the layers of artificial status and fear-mongering revealed a community capable of coexisting peacefully. Life on Oakhaven Ranch returned to its familiar rhythms, but with a newfound sense of security and, I'll admit, a quiet satisfaction. My grandfather's meticulous record-keeping and shrewd foresight had not only saved our ancestral land, but had inadvertently turned a hostile entity into a significant source of revenue and a chastened, respectful neighbor. It just goes to show, never underestimate the quiet ones, especially if they have a deep connection to their land and a knack for forensic accounting. The truth, like water, eventually finds its level, often washing away the arrogant and ill-informed in the process. And that, folks, is how I went from being the target of an HOA land grab to becoming their de facto landlord, all thanks to a forgotten 99-year lease and a president who truly believed her own hype. What's the craziest power trip you've ever witnessed from someone in a minor position of authority? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where the underdog comes out on top, armed with nothing but the facts and a little bit of old-fashioned grit. Thanks for tuning in.